The fall. James Williams stood at the pinnacle of success. At 42, he was the proud owner of one of the most renowned real estate firms in the city, specializing in high-end luxury properties. His business was thriving, the company was respected, and his name had become synonymous with ambition and achievement. He had clawed his way to the top, defying odds and prejudices that tried to hold him back. He had risen above systemic challenges and inequality, proving time and time again that with enough grit and resilience, anything was possible. James was a tall, imposing figure, his deep voice commanding respect when he spoke. His sharp intellect and quick wit had earned him admiration in boardrooms, and his unwavering commitment to his work had established him as a force to be reckoned with. Yet, despite the trappings of success, James had never forgotten the struggle. He had fought to build everything from scratch, and every step of the way had been a reminder of how far he had come and how much further he could go. His personal life, too, seemed perfect. Married to Sarah, a woman who had elegance and grace in every step, he believed he had it all. Their 5 children, Marcus, Jaden, Lily, Kayla, and Eli, filled their home with love and energy. James had always been driven by the desire to create a legacy for his family. He wanted to leave behind not just wealth, but a sense of pride, a legacy that would inspire his children to follow their own dreams and never accept anything less than greatness. Their eldest, Marcus, was 15 and the image of his father. Tall, determined, and fiercely ambitious, Marcus had inherited his father's strong work ethic and his desire to make something of himself. Jaden and Lily, 12 years old, each had their own special talents. Jaden was the athletic one, showing promise in every sport he tried, while Lily had an artistic soul, excelling in painting and music. Kayla, at 8, had a personality that could light up any room. Her infectious laughter was her trademark, and it never failed to bring a smile to everyone around her. Little Eli, only 6, had an insatiable curiosity, asking questions that seemed endless, but his innocence brought a certain lightness to their home. Their family had always been a source of joy, a unit bound together by love. But all of that was about to change. The cracks in their seemingly perfect life had been building for some time, and James had started to notice them more and more, though he had brushed them off. He had been so focused on his work, so consumed with expanding his empire, that he didn't fully see what was happening under his own roof. It wasn't just the late nights Sarah had begun to spend away from home, nor the increasingly curt conversations they had. It was in the way she looked at him sometimes, a look that was filled with something James couldn't quite put his finger on. Perhaps it was regret. Perhaps it was something deeper. He would never know. The evening of the city's annual philanthropy gala should have been a crowning achievement for James. It was a night to celebrate his efforts in improving the lives of the city's underprivileged residents through housing projects, and he was set to receive an award for his contributions. The gala was filled with glittering lights, elegant dresses, and tuxedos, but beneath the surface, there was a tension that James couldn't ignore. Sarah, dressed in a sleek, shimmering gown that hugged her figure perfectly, was by his side as they entered the grand ballroom. Her smile was flawless, her laughter the kind that made people take notice. But to James, it seemed like an act, a performance she had perfected over the years. Her eyes, which once sparkled with love and pride, seemed distant now. As they posed for photos and exchanged pleasantries with guests, James could feel a shift, a growing gap between them that had been widening for months. But he couldn't dwell on it that night. This was his moment, and nothing was going to ruin it. The award, the recognition, the acknowledgement of everything he had worked for was finally within his grasp. James believed that once the night was over, everything would return to normal. Sarah's quiet tension would disappear, and they would return to their life as it had been before. But as the evening drew to a close, it became clear that Sarah had already made up her mind. The look she gave him, when the applause died down, and the final speech was delivered, was unlike any he had ever seen. It wasn't admiration. It wasn't pride. It was a mixture of something else, something colder, more resigned. As they left the gala, Sarah's silence was palpable. They rode in the back of the limousine, side by side but miles apart. James couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Yet he still held on to the hope that they could talk it out when they got home, that whatever was bothering her could be fixed. But when they arrived at their house, Sarah was already distant. She barely said a word as they entered the house, and James felt the weight of her silence pressing on him. He tried to initiate conversation, but she was non-committal, offering only vague responses. The house, which had always been full of life and energy, suddenly felt suffocating. That night, as they lay in bed, James finally asked, "Sarah, what's going on?" Her reply was simple, but it shattered him. "I can't do this anymore, James." The words hung in the air between them, a finality in her voice that left him speechless. His heart dropped. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had built this life with her. They had created this family together. And now she was telling him she couldn't do it anymore. The conversation that followed was one that James would never forget. Sarah explained that she had felt trapped for years, suffocated by the expectations placed on her as his wife, by the constant pressure of living up to an image that didn't feel like her own. She had begun to question who she was, and somewhere along the way, her love for him had faded. She needed to find herself, she said. She needed space. James tried to convince her to stay, to work through their issues, but Sarah's mind was made up. The decision was final. She packed a bag that night, kissed their children goodbye, and walked out of the door. She was gone. The weeks that followed were a blur of emotion and confusion for James. He had always been the strong one, the resilient one, but now he felt like a man adrift in a storm. The weight of raising 5 children on his own was immense, but the deeper pain, the loss of Sarah, the woman he had once thought was his soulmate, was unbearable. He couldn't understand how someone could walk away from everything they had built together. Yet life went on. James threw himself into his work, focusing on his company and his family. There was no time for self-pity. He had children to care for, an empire to run, and a legacy to build. He raised his children with love and dedication, but every day was a reminder of the void that Sarah's absence had left behind. Marcus, Jaden, Lily, Kayla, and Eli grew older, wiser, and stronger, but they could never fill the gap left by their mother. They were his strength, but the ache of her leaving never fully healed. In the years that followed, James became a man defined by his resilience. He achieved even greater success, building his company into one of the most powerful real estate firms in the city. But behind every success was the quiet, unspoken sadness of losing Sarah, the woman he had once thought would be by his side forever. As time passed, the world began to forget about the tragedy that had befallen James and his family. People only saw the man who had made it, the man who had beaten the odds. But James knew the truth. He knew that no amount of success or wealth could ever replace what he had lost. And then, one day, his phone rang. It was Sarah. The return. James had been living a life of relative peace, though it was often punctuated by quiet moments of longing. It had been 10 years since Sarah walked out, leaving behind their 5 children and the life they had built together. In that time, he had poured himself into work, ensuring that Williams' real estate continued to flourish, but the wound from his past, from Sarah's departure, never truly healed. His children had become his everything, his source of strength, his pride, his motivation. Marcus was now 25, having graduated from college with honors and stepping into the real estate business with his father's mentorship. Jaden, now 22, was a rising star in professional basketball, while Lily, 22 as well, had pursued a career in the arts and was already getting attention for her musical talents. Kayla, at 18, was preparing for college, a bright young woman with dreams of starting her own nonprofit organization to help underprivileged communities. Eli, at 16, had developed an interest in engineering and was attending a specialized high school for his passion. The Williams children were thriving, each carving out their own path in the world. But even though they had grown into extraordinary individuals, there was always something missing from their lives. There had always been an empty space at the dinner table, a hollow place in their hearts where Sarah's love used to reside. She had been their mother, their nurturer, and her absence had left an indelible mark on their lives, one that they didn't fully comprehend as children, but began to understand as they grew older. James never remarried. There had been opportunities, people who showed interest, but none of them ever truly fit. No one could ever replace Sarah. No one could fill the space she had left. He didn't speak about her much, but his children knew how much he still missed her. It wasn't something that needed to be said out loud. It was something that existed in the quiet moments, in the way he sometimes looked at old photos of their family before she left. They had all grown accustomed to it, to the absence that lingered in the air. And so, life went on. James built his empire further, expanding his real estate business into new markets, opening offices across the country, and becoming more influential with each passing year. He was a well-known figure in philanthropic circles, too, having spent years supporting housing initiatives for underprivileged communities. He had everything a man could want, but the truth was that he had always wanted something more. He had wanted to build his family's future with Sarah by his side, raising their children together, growing old together. Then, one afternoon, as James sat in his office overlooking the bustling city below, the phone rang. The number on the caller ID was unfamiliar, but something about it tugged at him. He answered it without hesitation, unsure of what to expect, but hoping against hope that it wasn't the call he thought it might be. "Hello." James's voice was steady, though a hint of nervousness crept into his tone. "James," the voice on the other end said, and he felt his heart stop. It was Sarah. He could hear the distance in her voice, the years of silence that had accumulated between them. Her tone was calm, but there was an underlying hesitation that he couldn't ignore. "Sarah?" he asked, almost disbelieving. There was a long pause before she spoke again. "I'm coming to the city. I need to see you." The words sent a chill through James's spine. After all these years, after everything that had happened, she was finally reaching out. His mind raced. Was she coming back? Was this some sort of reconciliation? Did she want to fix things, to repair the years that had been lost? "I don't know what to say," he replied, the confusion and emotion rising in his chest. "What's going on? Why now?" "I can't explain everything over the phone," Sarah answered, her voice soft but firm. "I've changed, James. I've spent the last decade trying to figure things out. And now, I need to face what happened." The conversation was brief, but it left James reeling. What did it mean? He had built a life without her. He had raised their children, watched them grow, and succeeded in business. But there was always a part of him that had held on to the hope that Sarah might come back, that somehow, someday, they could heal the wounds of the past. Now here she was, reaching out after all these years. James wasn't sure what to expect. He wasn't sure what he wanted. The past 10 years had been a long, painful journey, and he had made peace with it in a way, or so he thought. But now, Sarah's return was like a storm that was about to hit, one that would upend everything. He called his children that night, told them about the call. They, too, were shocked. Marcus, the eldest, was the first to speak. "Dad, do you think this is real? Do you think she really wants to come back?" James didn't have an answer. He hadn't been given any assurances, just the simple words, "I need to face what happened." He told them what Sarah had said, but the words felt hollow. He had no idea what Sarah's intentions were, but the thought of her returning after all this time stirred something deep within him. "What do you want us to do?" Marcus asked. "I don't know," James replied. "I need to see her first, to understand what's in her heart." The children, though they hadn't seen their mother in years, all had their own feelings about the situation. Some were angry, others confused, and some, like Marcus, were more cautious. They had lived without Sarah for so long that the idea of her returning felt almost surreal. She had walked away from them. And now, years later, she was coming back as though nothing had happened. The following week, Sarah arrived in the city. James arranged to meet her at his office. When he saw her walk through the door, he was taken aback. She hadn't changed much. Her face was older, of course, and there was a certain sadness in her eyes. But there was something else too. A quiet strength, a vulnerability that hadn't been there before. She looked at him for a long moment, as if she were waiting for him to speak first. But James found himself speechless, unsure of what to say. The years between them had turned their once easy connection into something unfamiliar, something tentative. He gestured for her to sit, and they both remained silent for a long time. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "I don't expect you to forgive me, James," she began. Her voice was steady but tinged with regret. "I don't expect everything to be okay. I know I've hurt you, and I know I've hurt our children. But I've spent all this time thinking about what happened, about why I left, and I can't live with the guilt anymore." James listened, but his mind was racing. He didn't know how to feel. He didn't know if he could ever truly forgive her for abandoning them, for walking out on everything they had built together. He had moved on with his life, built a future for his children, and now she was here, asking for something he wasn't sure he was ready to give. "I'm not the same person I was, James," Sarah continued, her eyes searching his. "I'm not asking for you to take me back, but I do want to make things right. I want to be a part of their lives again, if you'll allow me." James stared at her, his mind spinning. Could he allow her back into their lives? Could he risk opening his heart again after all this time? The strain of forgiveness. The air in James's office felt thick, heavy with unspoken words, and the weight of the past decade. He hadn't expected this moment to come, not in the way it had. Sarah sat across from him, her presence undeniable. Time had altered her. It had left marks on her face, etched lines of regret, but there was something deeper within her eyes, something that felt almost desperate. She was no longer the woman who had walked out of his life all those years ago. The woman before him now carried the weight of those years, and as she spoke, it became clear that the path she had taken was far from easy. "I've changed, James," Sarah continued, her voice trembling slightly. "I didn't realize it at the time, but I was running away from everything. From you, from the life we built, from myself. But in the years I've been gone, I've had to face what I did. I've had to live with the guilt of abandoning my children. Abandoning you." James listened to her words, each one cutting through him like a blade. Her voice, though soft, was filled with a certain strength. She wasn't the same woman who had left him, that was clear. But could he forgive her? Could he ever truly forgive the years of absence, the pain she had caused him and their children? The silence between them stretched for what felt like an eternity. His mind raced, conflicting emotions swirling within him. On one hand, he had moved on. He had raised his children alone, and they had turned out to be incredible individuals, far better than anyone had ever expected. Marcus was a force to be reckoned with in his own right. Jaden had made a name for himself in the sports world, and Lily was becoming a renowned artist. Kayla had found her calling in social work, and Eli, too, was excelling in his field of engineering. James had been their rock, their constant. But on the other hand, there was still a part of him that missed Sarah, a part of him that had always hoped she would return, that somehow they could rebuild what they had lost. But now that she was here, the reality was different. It wasn't just about the two of them anymore. It was about their children, their family, the people who had been affected by her absence. How could he even begin to explain to them why their mother had left? How could he ask them to open their hearts to someone who had walked out of their lives so easily? "I don't know if I can forgive you, Sarah," James finally said, his voice low but steady. He could feel the pain in his words, the weight of everything they had been through. "You left us, and we had to figure things out on our own. You weren't there when we needed you. I don't know if I can ever forget that." Sarah nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. She had expected this. She had known that forgiveness would not come easily, especially after everything she had done. But she had to try. For herself, for her children, and for the family they once were. "I don't expect you to forget, James," she said softly. "But I hope in time you can understand why I did what I did. I wasn't ready then, but I am now. I'm ready to face everything, to face my mistakes, and to try and make things right." James felt the tightness in his chest grow. He had always been the one to hold things together, to be the strong one for his children, for his business. He had been through so much in those 10 years, and now here she was, asking for something he wasn't sure he could give. The trust that had once existed between them had been shattered. Could it ever be rebuilt? "I don't know if you can fix what's been broken," James replied, his tone heavier now. "I don't know if you can make up for the years you've missed, for the pain you've caused." Sarah reached out, her hand trembling as she placed it on the table between them. "I'm not asking you to fix it, James," she said softly. "I'm asking you to let me try, to let me show you, and show our children, that I'm not the same person who left. I've done a lot of thinking, a lot of healing, and I know I can never undo the past. But I can try to make up for it. I can try to be the mother they deserve, the woman you deserve." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, James didn't know how to respond. Could he let her back into their lives? Could he allow her to become a part of their world again after everything that had happened? He had spent so many years building a life without her, a life that was fulfilling, rewarding, and full of love. His children had grown into wonderful individuals without her. The thought of upsetting that balance, of inviting the past back into their lives, filled him with uncertainty. As Sarah sat across from him, the tension in the room was palpable. James could see the remorse in her eyes, and part of him wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that she had truly changed, that she had spent these years reflecting on her actions. But another part of him, a part that had been scared by her absence, was hesitant. He couldn't erase the hurt, couldn't pretend that everything was okay just because she had come back. For the first time in years, James found himself at a crossroads. He could continue on the path he had built, the path that had kept him and his children safe, and shut out the possibility of reconciliation. Or he could take a chance, take a step into the unknown, and see if there was any possibility of healing the wounds that had festered for so long. "I don't know, Sarah," James said, his voice softer now, though still filled with doubt. "I don't know if I can let you back into our lives. It's not just about me. It's about the kids. They've been through so much, and I don't know how to explain any of this to them." Sarah nodded, understanding the weight of his words. "I know. I don't expect you to fix everything right away. I just want the chance to try, to show them that I'm not the same person I was when I left." James sat back in his chair, his fingers tapping absently on the desk as he processed everything Sarah had said. There were so many layers to this, so many emotions. He had built his life without her, and now, 10 years later, she was asking for a chance to be a part of it again. Could he open his heart to her once more? Could he trust her after everything? "I'll talk to the kids," James said finally, though he wasn't sure what he was going to say. "But I need you to understand. This won't be easy. It won't be a quick fix. It'll take time. It'll take a lot of work. And I don't know if they'll ever fully forgive you." "I know," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face now. "But I'll do whatever it takes, James. I'm ready to make things right, no matter how long it takes." James didn't know if he believed her. He didn't know if he could ever fully forgive her. But as he looked at her, sitting there with tears in her eyes, something inside him stirred. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was the possibility of something he hadn't felt in a long time. And for the first time in years, he wondered if it was possible to rebuild the family they had once been. The road to healing. The days following Sarah's return to the city were filled with an overwhelming sense of unease. James could not quite shake the feelings that had been stirred up in him. His world had been so carefully structured over the past decade. His family, his business, and the life he had built without Sarah. Now, the very foundation of that life was being tested in ways he couldn't have anticipated. The conversation with Sarah had left him conflicted. Part of him wanted to believe in her sincerity. He saw the remorse in her eyes, heard the genuine pain in her voice as she admitted her mistakes. But another part of him, a deeper part that had been scared by her departure, was wary. Could people really change? Could someone who had walked away from their family so easily come back after all this time and seamlessly reintegrate into their lives? He had no answers, only questions. But one thing was certain. He wasn't going to make any decisions in haste. This wasn't just about him. This was about his children, who had grown up without their mother, who had been raised by him alone. And though they had never openly expressed it, he knew they had all suffered from her absence. The first step was telling them. He hadn't spoken to them about Sarah's return yet, and the weight of that conversation loomed over him. He could already imagine the array of emotions that would flood through his children. Anger, confusion, disbelief. It had been years since they had heard anything about their mother, and now she was suddenly back in the picture. How could he explain that? How could he justify her absence all these years and ask them to welcome her back? That evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table, James knew he couldn't delay the conversation any longer. Marcus, now 25, was home for the weekend from his job at the real estate firm, and Jaden, 22, was visiting after a few games on the road. Lily, also 22, had taken a break from her music career to spend time with the family. Kayla, 18, was home from college, and Eli, 16, had just finished his homework. The table was filled with the chatter and noise of family life, but James could sense the underlying tension. He could feel his children's expectations hanging in the air. After a few moments of small talk, James finally spoke. "I need to tell you something," he began, his voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. "Something that's been on my mind for a while." The room grew silent, and all eyes turned to him. The faces of his children reflected a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Mom called me," he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "She's back in town." The reaction was immediate, a sharp intake of breath, followed by a heavy silence. Marcus, ever the eldest, was the first to speak. "Wait, you mean she's back? After all these years?" His voice was a mixture of disbelief and anger. "Why now? Why is she even here?" James took a deep breath, struggling to find the words. "I don't know, son, but she called, and she wants to try and make things right. She wants to see you all again." The tension in the room was palpable. Jaden, usually the more laid back of the group, looked up with narrowed eyes. "So after 10 years of not being here, she just shows up and expects us to accept her back into our lives." His voice was laced with bitterness. "I don't get it. How does she think she can just waltz in and pick up where she left off?" Kayla, always the empathetic one, sat silently, her eyes brimming with tears. "It's hard, I know," she said quietly. "But maybe we could try to understand where she's coming from. Maybe she's changed." Lily looked at her younger sister and then at her father. "I don't know, Kayla. I mean, she left us. Left us with you, Dad. You did everything for us. You were the one who showed up every day, no matter how hard it was. And now she wants to come back and just be part of it again." Eli, who had been mostly quiet, piped up. "I don't know what to think either, but I think we should at least hear her out right. Maybe she's not the same person who left. People can change." James looked at each of his children, their faces a mix of emotion, their pain and confusion laid bare. He felt a pang of guilt. He had always tried to protect them from the hurt that came with Sarah's departure, but now that she was back, he realized that there were so many layers of unresolved feelings within each of them. "I know this is difficult," James said softly, "and I understand your anger, your hurt. Believe me, I felt all of it. But Sarah has changed. I can see that. She's spent the last decade trying to understand what happened, trying to heal. And she wants to try and make amends. "But it's not just about her, is it, Dad?" Marcus asked, his voice thick with emotion. "It's about us. You and us. We've been doing fine without her. We've had you. You've been everything to us." James's heart ached. His children's loyalty was overwhelming, but he couldn't deny that they had all suffered from the absence of their mother. He hadn't been able to provide them with everything. There had always been that missing piece. He had done his best to be both mother and father to them, but he wasn't a woman, and there were things that they had missed out on because Sarah wasn't there. "I understand, Marcus," James said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "And I don't expect you to forgive her right away. But I want you to at least give her the chance to show that she's changed. She made a mistake, but she wants to try." The conversation stretched into hours, each child grappling with their own feelings, their own wounds. It was clear that no one was ready to open their hearts fully to Sarah just yet. The pain of her absence was still too fresh, too raw. But James knew that time was the key. He couldn't force his children to forgive their mother. He couldn't erase the past. But he could give them the space to process it, to work through their emotions at their own pace. And most importantly, he could allow Sarah the chance to prove that she wasn't the woman who had left them behind all those years ago. That night, James sat alone in his office, the weight of the conversation with his children heavy on his shoulders. He had never wanted to place this burden on them. They had already been through so much, but now he realized he was being asked to navigate an entirely new chapter in their lives, one that was filled with uncertainty, healing, and perhaps even forgiveness. As he gazed out at the city lights, James thought about what Sarah had said to him. She wanted to make things right. But how could that even be possible after all that had transpired? Could a family, once torn apart, truly heal? James didn't have the answers, but he knew one thing. The road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, and it would require patience, forgiveness, and a willingness to face the past in order to build a new future. And he was willing to try, for the sake of his children, for the sake of the family they once were. Fractures and new beginnings. The days after James's conversation with his children felt like a delicate dance, a slow and uncertain progression towards something unknown. It was clear that the return of Sarah, though welcomed by some, had created a deep divide among his children. Each of them, in their own way, wrestled with the idea of their mother's sudden reappearance in their lives after so many years. But there was a shared feeling between them, one that held more weight than the frustration, confusion, or even bitterness that had surfaced in their words, the feeling of betrayal. They had grown up without her. They had watched as their father shouldered the weight of not only raising them, but also becoming one of the most influential black men in the city. They had never questioned his strength or his love for them. But in their hearts, there had always been a gaping void, a silent grief over the absence of the woman who had once been their mother. And now, after so many years of living in that absence, Sarah's sudden desire to come back felt like a breach of an unspoken understanding. Could they even remember what it was like when she was there? Could they forgive her for disappearing when they had needed her the most? For James, these questions were no less complicated. Every time he looked at Sarah, he saw the woman he had once adored. But he also saw the woman who had walked away from everything they had built, leaving him to raise their 5 children alone. It was a truth he couldn't ignore, no matter how much he wanted to reconcile the past. He saw the tears in Sarah's eyes when she spoke of regret, of wanting to make things right. But could he believe her? Could he trust that the woman before him was truly the same person who had walked out of their lives with little explanation? Despite the hesitation and the lingering pain, James had agreed to let Sarah meet with the children individually. He knew that reconciliation couldn't be forced. It had to come at their own pace, and it had to be earned. He also knew that this wasn't just about Sarah re-entering their lives. It was about healing a family that had been fractured for far too long. Over the next few weeks, Sarah reached out to each of the children, one by one, to sit down and talk. James had hoped that their conversations would be a stepping stone toward rebuilding their relationship, but the reality was more complicated than that. Marcus, ever the pragmatic one, was the first to meet with her. James had always admired Marcus's ability to see things clearly, to make decisions based on logic and reason, but when it came to Sarah, he found himself at a loss. His mother had abandoned him at a time when he needed her most, and though he had always carried that pain with him, he hadn't known how to process it until now. The conversation between Marcus and Sarah was tense, filled with long silences and hesitant words. Sarah spoke of her regrets, her struggles in the years after leaving, and how she had sought therapy to understand her own actions. But Marcus was unconvinced. "I don't know why you left us, Mom," he said, his voice tight. "I can't understand why you chose to walk away when we needed you." "I don't expect you to understand," Sarah replied softly. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I want you to know that I'm sorry. I was lost, and I made a mistake. But I want to be here for you, for all of you, if you'll let me." Marcus had no immediate response. He couldn't offer her forgiveness. Not yet. But he didn't shut her out completely. Instead, he simply nodded and stood up, his voice barely above a whisper. "We'll see." The tension that had hung in the air was palpable. It wasn't anger that Marcus felt, but an overwhelming sadness. The sadness of realizing that the mother he had lost, the mother he had once known, might never return. Next, Jaden, with his guarded nature and competitive spirit, approached the situation differently. He had always been the one to bury his feelings beneath a tough exterior, focusing on his passion for basketball and using the court as a way to cope with the pain of his mother's absence. When Sarah asked to meet with him, he agreed, but it was clear he wasn't ready to forgive. Their conversation was full of defensive remarks from Jaden, as though he were trying to protect himself from opening up. "You weren't there when I needed you, Mom," he said, pacing in the living room, his hands clenched at his sides. "You don't get to just walk back in and pretend everything's fine." "I know, Jaden," Sarah said quietly, her voice full of regret. "I know I can't just fix everything. But I'm here now, and I'll do whatever it takes to show you that I'm not the same person who left." Jaden didn't respond right away, choosing instead to turn away, his back to her. It was clear that no amount of words would convince him overnight. The pain ran deeper than that. But there was a flicker in his eyes, a small crack in the walls he had built around himself. He wasn't ready to forgive. Not yet. But he wasn't ready to shut her out completely either. Lily, the creative and artistic soul of the family, had a more open heart than her brothers, though her feelings were no less complicated. She had always turned to music and art to express the turmoil she felt inside, often losing herself in her creative world when the pain of losing her mother became too much. But when Sarah reached out to her, Lily decided to meet with her. The meeting between mother and daughter was filled with tears and raw emotion. Lily spoke of the years she had spent trying to fill the emptiness left by her mother's absence, the way she had found solace in her art, but always felt like something was missing. She asked Sarah one question: "Why didn't you ever come back?" Sarah's voice trembled as she replied, "I was lost, Lily. I couldn't find my way back to you, and I didn't know how to make it right. But I want to try now. I want to be here for you, for all of you." Lily wiped away her tears and, for the first time in years, let herself believe that Sarah might be telling the truth. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step forward. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Mom," Lily whispered, her voice soft but determined. "But I want to believe that you've changed." Kayla, the peacemaker, was the next to meet with Sarah. The youngest of the siblings, Kayla had always been the most optimistic. She had spent years hoping that her mother would return, hoping for a reunion that never came. When Sarah came to her, Kayla listened with an open heart, willing to understand the pain that had caused her mother to leave. "I don't know if I can forgive you, but I want to try," Kayla said gently. "I've missed you, Mom. I've missed what could have been." Finally, Eli, the quiet, introspective teenager, found his own way to deal with the situation. He didn't have the anger or the pain that his older siblings felt. Instead, he quietly observed, processing everything in his own way. When it was his turn to meet with Sarah, he spoke to her with a calm that surprised even James. "I don't really remember you," Eli said softly, his voice full of thoughtfulness. "I was too young when you left. I don't know who you were then, but I know who I am now. I just want you to be real with me. I don't want any more lies or excuses." Sarah nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. "I promise, Eli, I'll be real with you. I'll show you who I am now." With each conversation, the children were slowly beginning to come to terms with Sarah's return. The walls between them hadn't come down yet, but there was a shift, a sense that maybe, just maybe, healing could begin. For James, watching his children wrestle with their emotions was both heartbreaking and hopeful. He knew that the road ahead would be long, that forgiveness would not come easily, but he also knew that there was room for change. And so, as Sarah continued her quiet journey to rebuild the trust that had been broken, James held on to the hope that the fractures in their family could be healed, one conversation at a time.